time for questions by members of council. Councilman Cashman.
Thank you, Mr. President. Anybody from CPD that would like to talk? I have a few questions. Let's see here. So the project that brought this to everybody's attention up on Humboldt Street, that is going to be about 104 units on 2 lots, correct? Something of that nature.
That sounds right. I don't have the exact unit count.
Okay. And they have 0 parking requirements because they're under the old ordinance, correct?
Yes, they've been approved.
And is that affordable housing?
I don't believe it's deeded as affordable housing, but they are small units. They're all less
But they're not, it's not an affordable housing project by any definition the city has. There's no tax credits. It's not being sold at less than market value.
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Okay, so I'm wondering, do we have evidence that shows that if we don't build parking, that developers are going to become kind-hearted and sell their units at less than market rate? Or is this a supposition?
I think the supposition is that surface parking on a 6250 lot takes up a lot of space, one, and costs. It has a significant cost, and so when you factor those things together, it trickles down to the affordability issue. But I can't say I have specific statistical evidence of.
I agree with that. The original bill was written in 2006. There's no way that bill could have envisioned 54 units on a lot, right? I mean, is there any part of you that thinks that planners were thinking about that back then?
I think it's evolved in the last 10 years, and there's a lot of unintended consequences.
Right. So as that being a baseline wouldn't make a lot of sense for the reality that we exist in today, I don't think. So I hear a lot of concern from CPD about how this affects affordability. So when this council passed the zoning for, I think it's about 100 acres of Arapahoe Square without any affordable component in downtown, as fine a transit location as you could find, was CPD concerned about affordable housing then?
I can't speak to that, so I can.
Okay.
Someone else would like to stand up straight.
I may have one more. And this bill, as I understand it, makes no requirement on any developer to provide car share, transit passes, or anything of that nature, correct?
Those incentives are already built into the code for parking reductions you can get, so they're already there, but it's not a mandatory thing with this bill, as it's not mandatory now.
And my understanding is that Denver's single occupant vehicle ride share has gone up the past 2 years. Am I remembering that correctly?
I'm not sure. I see a head
Tara's
nod.
nodding yes.
Okay, yeah. It must be
Okay,
right then.
those are my questions. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Cashman. Councilman Cashman, and I just wanted to jump in on the Arapahoe Square piece. And Sarah, I'm gonna look at you, but we have no parking requirements in the Arapahoe Square new zoning because that issue came up.
No, I wasn't talking about parking requirements. I was talking about affordable housing.
That's good. I just wanted to give further context. And in our zoning to date, we don't have a mechanism for affordable housing, but it's coming up at 38th and Blake. So stay tuned. I like your questioning.
It's a large part of this discussion, so I wanted to draw the...
That's good. I see it. Councilman Clark.
Thank you, Mr. President. Jeff, can I back up here? And sorry, I can't find the presentation that you had in our system. So I don't know if I misspeak, you can bring up the slide. I don't know if it's still on there or not. But I just want to, so CPD supported Councilman Brooks' bill before my amendments were adopted, correct?
Yes.
But is now opposing it because of my amendments, correct?
Yeah, I mean, that's essentially it, yeah.
So on the slide, and since it's up here, if you can bring it up, the justification for opposing, at least on one of the conditions, was that it was not consistent with adopted plans because it increased the level of parking.
Right.
Correct? Now, I conveniently, the slides after that showed one example that would have still been 0 with Brooks' bill and would have been 8 with my amendments, but add another story to that building, add 2 more stories to that building, and Brooks' number is not 0 anymore. So there are circumstances under Brooks' bill that would have added parking, correct?
That's fair, yeah,
So
absolutely.
I guess that's...
It's the tipping point and sort of that threshold, which is not, you can't get at a specific number. This isn't super scientific, but it did reach a critical sort of tipping point from our perspective.
Okay, so talk to me about that tipping point, because I don't see where you have outlined in a plan that it says adding parking is okay up to a tipping point. I see that it says adding parking is not consistent. They both added parking. Mine adds a little bit more parking, but that seems to me to be a very subjective decision that staff has made on what that tipping point is.
Yeah, I think it's the tipping point in part, which is it's based on, there's any number of scenarios you could look at for how many parking spaces would be required depending on number of units, square footage. So it's that sort of threshold that we looked at, one, but then also the planning board process and recommendation and the steering committee process and recommendation that represented a compromise, which was it was added parking to what we're sort of working with our baseline now, but at least from our perspective, and others feel free to jump up, it was all of those things combined in terms of the process leading to a compromise and our analysis of how many additional parking spaces would be required if you take off a story.
Yeah, I'm not digging into all of it right now. I took particular issue, I guess, with the slide that said that you were opposed because my amendments added parking, and I just wanted to clarify that I hadn't missed something. Councilman Brooks' proposal also added parking, but a subjective decision was made on staff's point that cannot be directly linked to any adopted plan that tells us what that tipping point is, or that even makes mention of a tipping point.
I don't think we have any plans that I would get into that level of detail at all, so no, we don't have that.
Again, I guess on this, not getting to planning board, not getting to anything else, if there is no adopted plan that says that or defines a tipping point, but staff has made a decision to oppose based on a tipping point, but then claiming that it is because of adopted plans, seems to me like a little bit of a stretch.
Yeah, sir, feel free. There's also the Z-pin component as well.
We'll get to that one. I'm just talking about opposing to my amendments adding parking when Councilman Brooks' bill also added parking, and that was under the slide, specifically saying that it is inconsistent with citywide plans, which means that somehow Councilman Brooks' proposal was consistent with those same plans.
Sure. So, and I do think the Z-pin component is important that Jeff was going to talk about. Since you want to talk about this particular topic, the only point I wanted to add, I think everything Jeff said was very on point. I guess 2 things. One is just to clarify, was the process to even look at amending this exemption to begin with was initiated by council in the moratorium, and CPD has been trying to provide a technical lens throughout the process. And when it comes to analyzing where the current amendment is, I think the tipping point that we're talking about is, I think we'd agree with you. I wouldn't necessarily call it subjective. I think we're trying to make it as objective as we could based on actually looking at parcels and what you can build on them. But where the tipping point really comes in and the plan analysis is also about preserving the pattern of small lots. And our concern is that the tipping point that's being reached will encourage lot assembly and go against our adopted plan policies of preserving that pattern and a kind of cherished attribute of the community. And I think we definitely agree with you that there's not a bright line or a clear objective If there was, we probably wouldn't have had to do this process because everybody would have been able to say, oh, if we just apply this formula or follow this science, then we know the right balance to make sure these lots can still be developed is X number of stories get exempted and, X number don't. We don't have something that clear. But our analysis was trying to get at when do you reach that tipping point where we're afraid that the lots will not be able to have enough flexibility to redevelop, and therefore we lose the pattern of those small lots.
I guess still confusing because that analysis never said once you reach this number. So it should be added parking, but at this number. There were instances even under Brooks' proposal with a certain number of stories that would have exceeded that, but you guys weren't opposed to that. So anyway, I think we've hashed that one out. Getting to the ZPIN, and maybe if Tina can come answer a few questions I have about that, and then Jeff, if you want to jump in back to that. But Tina, is there anywhere else in the code where your staff is required to review something that calls for less parking than would just be allowed?
Yes.
Yeah. So there are other places where staff is making a decision on how deep the discount or the reduction in parking should be beyond city council says yes to this and no to that. Or our rules say yes to this, no to that. There's somewhere else where someone is.
There's an existing provision that's been in the code since before 2010. It came into play in the 90s, I think, that requires essentially a ZPIN process if a combination of asks for reductions exceeds 50% of the required. It's a carryover. If I had to redo it today, I'd say for the same
But
reason.
on the books right now, somebody could walk in tomorrow with a proposal asking for a reduction of below 50% per those rules, nothing to do with small lots, and your staff, who have
But it's not an all or nothing game. I mean, here, you don't get anything until you go through the ZPIN process. And then somehow we're supposed to come up with the number. It's all or nothing. You either get the exemption or you don't.
But if you want less than 50%, you either
But you've
get
already
less than
gotten
50%
you've
or you
already
don't.
gotten 50% off, reduced through the code, and it's a lot easier to understand the underlying intent that this had to be something pretty extraordinary to get more than 50%. We don't have that kind of direction here. It's, do you get the exemption or do you not? And somehow the ZPIN process is going to tell us that? We don't think so. We could make that decision up front if you would just make them subject to the exemption or not.
Okay. All right. Those are my questions for now. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Councilman Clark. Let's see, we had Councilman Lopez Councilman Flynn was first. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. President. And actually, I want to thank Councilman Clark because he asked almost all of the questions that I had about the inconsistency of recommending one, but not recommending the other when they both were apparently inconsistent. But one other thing, maybe Tina, to expand on the recommendation that we deny this also because it provides for ZPIN because it creates a false expectation for public input or whatever it was the slide said. Can you talk about that a little more about why letting the public know what's going on in their neighborhood is something that's going to create a problem?
Sure. There's no problem in letting people know. We always encourage developers to do their part to let the neighborhood know what's coming and be a good neighbor. Whether you do it or not, there's no code requirement for it. The ZPIN, it's not just that it's asking for public input. It's a lot of steps, a lot of processing, a lot of resources to put out there, an opportunity to make comments to the city, and we're supposed to take those comments and somehow use them together with the criteria in the code and come up with a decision. We don't use the ZPIN process to let people know about a project. That's something else.
Okay.
So we're using a ZPIN, from what I can tell, to give notice that this project is happening, but the ZPIN is supposed to be more than that. So it's a bit of a misuse, I think, of a process without a lot of value added back.
Okay. And I had a question for Karen, but maybe Tina, you can answer it since Karen's all the way in the back. If we vote no, if we follow your recommendation and vote no, then effectively we go back to total parking exemption, correct? Sure. Okay, thank you.
All right, Councilman Flynn, thank you. Councilman Lopez?
Yes, thank you, Mr. President. Cindy, I don't know if you can come to the front. I just want to have a question. This may be planning and public works, and I just wanted to ask the status. So when we talk about mass transit, modern-day transit system, moving people, I know that we had discussions, and there's just a lot of different ways and a lot of different plans that are out there that we're working on, and you that know it intimately. There's just so much that goes by, I kind of forget where things are right now. And I was wondering if you can give us an update on the bus rapid transit, the BRT plans to date, and kind of an update on where that is on Colfax. And I don't want to just, I'm not just trying to put you on the spot, I'm just trying to get a little bit more information about where we're at there. And I don't know if CPD has been working with you to.
Yeah, I'm by no means the expert. Hi, everyone. Cindy
Right,
Patton.
just generally, Cindy,
Acting
if you can.
Manager of Parking and Mobility Services in Public Works. And that is, it's not one of my projects, but in
Right.
general, the conversation about BRT on Colfax has been in progress for quite some time. Right now, the project is funded for design, I believe, and is moving through that process, looking at environmental impacts and those types of things, also looking at configurations and how the transit service will most efficiently operate on Colfax. There's, as you know, a go bond process happening right now, talking about funding of different transit opportunities. There's a number of different transit enhancement options on that list, and that list will continue to be reviewed as it moves through the go bond process, all the way until you all refer that list to the ballot in July, I believe. So does that help?
It does. Aside from, I know that we have, some funding on Colfax and the bond, should it, move on to voters and be absorbed. So I definitely understand that piece. And I really appreciate the update, but have we added any additional length? Because right now it goes from Yosemite.
No.
Or no, I'm sorry, it goes all the way from 225 or something like that. And it stops at Federal.
Right, the Denver portion.
The Denver
ends
portion,
at-
but it
at
goes all the
Yosemite.
way to, it basically
The
goes to
opportunity to
225.
extend is certainly there, but it's related to the funding and our partnerships with other jurisdictions.
Cindy, we haven't added any funding to go further west, right? To this date?
I can't
haven't.
speak to that. I don't believe so.
Okay. I just want to know if we made any progress, because this is something I brought up a year ago. And I'm not trying to put you on the spot, Cindy.
get
You're
it.
just a
In Public
messenger.
Works.
I don't want anybody to think that I'm trying to give her hell. It's just the idea. I just want to know if we made any progress since our last discussion. And I know that there's other folks it's their baby that they're working on. So, no, I appreciate the answer that you have for me, Cindy. Yeah, Mr. President, I just wanted to ask where we were, if there was any new plans or anything else, because
We can get you.
consistently been trying to ask for it to continue down to
Yep.
the other side of the city.
We can have, ask Gabby in the mayor's office to get you some information through Public Works and CPD on that, folks who are working on that. Okay, thanks,
you,
Councilman
Cindy.
Councilman Lopez and Cindy, who works in parking. Let's get Councilman Espinoza.
I actually didn't have any questions until all the questioning started. So question for staff. Did staff steer the task force away from or diminish the request to add Z-Pen? Did diminish the request by members of the task force to add Z-Pen language because of policy?
That was Councilman Brooks's committee. We weren't in a position to do any steering. We were there more for technical support.
So I can answer that. I think the conversation did come up, and in all honesty, I think staff did push back and said this would create some issues for A, B, and C reason. But the committee did have that conversation.
Okay. When engaging the public for input and having community input on zoning changes, does CPD policy frame the discussion? If so, God help us on anything on what makes the Blueprint Denver
Councilman.
recommendations or what gets
Councilman.
followed through on by the agency.
Is this a question or is this a comment?
Yeah, we have policy, and I have seen this happen before, which is there might be a good suggestion, but it's not consistent with policy, not the law, the ordinance, mind you, policy. So our staff is reviewing this task force recommendation and what gets printed and shared with the public. Same with the larger issues. Is policy driving what is and isn't basically put out there for public consumption and consideration?
Well, the only policy, we have to stick to the text amendment criteria in the code, and that does point to citywide policies, so that's the only policy we're really looking at when we're making our recommendation.
We're talking about changes to adopted ordinance, and when we open a task force up to both developers and the community, and we get this thing and we try to achieve consensus, the idea is that we open it up completely. And if that means Z-Pen, like it or not, we should be considering that, shouldn't we?
I think that all options were on the table.
Okay. We're talking about 11 small lot parking exempt projects in 8 months. The public expectation is that the zoning administrator is both resourceful enough and competent enough to make competent decisions
stay on
regarding the
questions.
impact of development on existing context.
Councilman.
Knowing the skills of our staff,
Councilman
I believe we
Espinoza.
have people up to the task.
And the 11 projects were prior to this process even starting. So please keep it to questions. You got plenty of time and comments. Councilwoman Sussman.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to ask Joel Noble to come up. I have some questions. Thank you, Joel. As you know, I have a lot of concerns about these bills, not the least of which is concerns about development along Colfax and how much we are trying to support new neighborhood serving development, but also on Federal and other places, Main Street places. Can you address what you think this amendment might mean for the sort of the small lot concepts that we're trying to promote? Or I guess it was more that we heard it was the small lot patterns.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me up. I wasn't planning to speak tonight. I'm happy to speak to you on my own behalf, my own opinions. I do serve on the Denver Planning Board, but based on the Denver Planning Board bylaws, I can't speak on their behalf. So.
Right. But I'd welcome your opinion.
Okay. I try to listen pretty carefully to public sentiment. What are people interested in? What are they interested in preserving? What are they interested in defending against? And in the zoning code update process that I followed very closely with Councilwoman Madison, I heard a lot of people in the public concerned about preserving the pattern of small lots, of small buildings, whether they're new buildings or old buildings, that character along the street. And this parking exemption as a tool prototyped on Colfax to preserve that by not requiring more parking than can actually be fit on the sites was viewed as pretty successful just a few years in, and the zoning code update process extended it. And when we look today about frustrations that we hear in the public, one of the frustrations we hear is we're losing the character. People say things are ugly, new development is too big, it's out of context, it's changing the character. So it's been of particular surprise to me throughout this process that there hasn't been more discussion, either in the public or frankly at council, about preserving that small lot character. Instead, we have a proposal here that, while talking about parking and whether we believe people will have a car or not, and talking about supply and demand, fundamental supply and demand issues, if you produce more housing, then there's more supply and the price should come down for a given amount of demand. Nobody's really talking about the preserving the small lot character. I brought with me, CPD produced an analysis on a sample project, the same sort of sample project they showed earlier, of the amount of parking spaces that would be required for a sample project under various scenarios, how much is exempt, et cetera. And in nearly all the cases in the CMX zoning, which is the MX is the most common of any of the zoning that any of these small lots have, far more parking is required that can be fit on the site. 16 spaces, 8 spaces, 24, 48, depending on the mix here. So it's obvious that if something can't fit, it won't be done. If you can't fit 24 spaces on one of these very small lots, you're not going to. You're going to do one of three other things. You're going to let it go, and we don't get revitalization. Things stay dormant. And that's a problem we have on Colfax quite a bit, and throughout the city. You're going to tear down every other building.
Right.
So I'll redevelop this building, redevelop this site, tear down the one next to it to park it, because I've met my parking requirements. And I got to tell you, when that happens, the public isn't happy, because they're like, what happened to the character of the street? You have these parking lots, every other one. Or you're going to assemble several lots together and do a much bigger building that means you have enough space to provide all the parking. And then the public is going to say, what happened to the character of our small lot pattern? So I really regret the way this conversation is going, because I was part of the conversation leading up to 2010, and I know that people who think about design and regret the changes they see happening in the city are going to regret the inevitable either lack of preserving the small lot character or stagnation or the missing teeth effect that we're going to get if this passes.
Thank you. I was going to use that missing teeth analogy too, because I hear it from developers. And when you have the missing teeth along a street, it discourages any new kinds of concepts going on. I appreciate you. Thank you very much, Joel. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Councilwoman Sussman. Councilman Espinoza, you have a question?
Yes, Joel, come back up. Since Mary Beth put you on the spot, I might as well ask you a question related to what was already discussed. If the recommendation of the task force, and I mean, let me first ask, are you familiar with, were you here for the entire staff presentation today?
Yes.
And then are you comfortable and familiar with the proposed text amendment that's on the table today?
I'm familiar with it. Are you asking if I'm comfortable with it?
No, familiar with the actual language of the text.
Yes.
So if that language were the recommendation of the task force and presented to planning board, given the criteria of planning board, is there any reason why planning board would not have recommended approval?
Again, I can't speak to planning board, but I'm happy to talk about the topic of the criteria, because a couple months ago, when the moratorium was going to be extended, a comment that you made about the criteria caught my attention. You said that the criteria that the staff report was reviewing and the planning board reviewed is different than the criteria that council reviews, which actually is not correct. According to the zoning code, the criteria is exactly the same. It wouldn't make any sense for planning board or staff to weigh in on criteria different than the criteria that you're analyzing. So the key criteria in a lot of these things is consistency with adopted plans. And if you read the staff report and you read the letters that were sent in from the people who did speak to that, including Ken Schreppel, a professor of urban planning, it goes point by point through all the things in Blueprint Denver that argue for the kinds of diversity you can have when you lower the parking requirements. And I couldn't find anything in my analysis for the planning board work that argued for increasing parking requirements. And so today you've got staff saying to you that they don't find this proposal consistent with adopted plans. At planning board, we had to look at, okay, how inconsistent is it versus other goals and the recommendation of the task force? For me, and I can only speak for myself, that very, very popular 3-story zoning, very neighborhood compatible, keeping the small lot character at the 3-story zoning was the tipping point, to Councilman Clark's comment. The fact that Councilman Brooks' proposal, when it's near transit, when it's at the places that can best support people's ability to live a car-free lifestyle if they choose to, and if a developer chooses to provide that product, that was a good tipping point to say we're providing a diversity of options, meeting all the goals in Blueprint Denver well enough, because you can still build that very popular 3-story product on the 3-story zoning, which I think is the most common zoning where these small lots are found. When you go beyond that, and to your point, if today's proposal had come to Planning Board, I can't speak for anybody else, but I would be very challenged to find it consistent with Blueprint Denver.
That's interesting, because most of my point when I spoke at Planning Board were on the argument about density and units per acre that are very much part of Blueprint Denver, but nowhere in our code, which this does not go to addressing, which has dramatic impact because a 54-unit project on a seventh of an acre is 240 units per acre, which is not at all representative of single-family duplex zone districts that are areas of stability where these areas. So but I asked you to sort of consider the language by itself, and all you did was a comparison, which that in fact occurred at Planning Board as well, because Councilman Clark's proposal was mentioned, and the comments from Planning Board were very clear to sort of put down that suggestion. But I'm asking is if this still represents a reduction in parking requirements over any base zone district. So is the criteria that is met, I mean, that needs to be met in order to get Planning Board approval, is the criteria met by this ordinance, or are we now, if we approve it, are we in violation of our own criteria?
I probably can't do any better than Planning Board itself did, and because Planning Board recommended of the original proposal approval with a condition that the parking requirements not be further increased, because, in my opinion, it would reach this point where achieving the goals in Blueprint Denver of having a variety of housing options and having a variety of being able to live with or without a car would be compromised. And staff's report today, I think, emphasizes that.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you, Councilman Espinoza. Councilwoman Sussman.
Yes, sorry. Mr. Hickman, I have a question for you, if you could come to the podium. Mr. Hickman. Yes, I noticed that you've been attending our GeoBond Transportation and Mobility meetings, and very grateful for that, and all of the volunteering you have done on this issue.
Well, I attended one this last
The
Thursday.
last one, which was a very important one.
It was stimulating.
That's for sure. And we had several speeches by the Ken Schroppel that was mentioned, and Jill Locantore, about our need to consider how much we subsidize cars, and particularly single occupancy vehicles, and how the experts and the people who are studying this says we have to think very difficult situations about our not subsidizing car use as much as we do. And as I was watching you, I was wondering, I wonder what Mr. Hickman is thinking about this in terms of the small lot parking exemption issue that I know you've been promoting.
Wow. Do you really expect me to answer that?
I do.
By midnight?
Well, maybe in about 2 minutes, 3 minutes.
Thank you. The issue, of course, is that anything we do needs to be weighed against the resources that we take to do it. Okay? At the root of this issue, I think, is the fact that people still own cars. We hope, and I'm one of them, we hope that people will own fewer and fewer cars in the future. I think I said that earlier tonight. But meanwhile, the reality is people have cars, we have to store them somewhere. and our streets have only so much capacity for anything. And I think one of the last things that we need to do is to use that right-of-way that was discussed a lot in that meeting for more parking. That right-of-way is there for other uses that would be much more beneficial and advantageous to the citizens of Denver. Does that help?
That's really good, and I appreciate that response. And I thank you for attending. So thank you, Mr.
Thank you.
President.
Do you have time for a small joke?
No, I think that's only in comment.
I'll answer for her. No, she doesn't right now. Councilman Lopez. This is my guy. Did you have some?
You know what, I do, but for comments, so.
Okay, great.
I'll make my comments then.
Great. Couple questions. I think we, first of all, let me just ask, just raise your hand if you are a developer in the room. Okay, great. And did the D-Line folks, did they leave already? Okay, that's unfortunate. Okay, we'll go on to comments then. Let me, there's my gavel. Okay. The public hearing for 161 is now closed. We're going to comments. Councilman Clark.
Thank you, Mr. President. This one's been a long haul, and we've been beating this one up a lot. I'll start with once again thanking you, Mr. President, for taking this on and for also being open to disagreement and conversation and evolution and helping me along the way with how I worked things that you didn't agree with. And so I think that is an important part of our process up here. Councilman Herndon's not here, but he always says we can disagree, but that doesn't mean we have to be disagreeable. And I think I take that with me, and I just really appreciate how you have led us on this issue. I also want to thank staff sitting here in the front row tonight. I know it's not easy dealing with us up here, and we're a cagey bunch of crazies. You can quote me on that one. I just want to say thank you. Again, we get heated, we get into this, but at the end of the day, you guys have the hardest job in the world trying to balance all of this and all of us who have very different feelings. A couple things that I just want to say that I think that, very quickly to go through the stuff that I touched on in questions, I was asking questions about. If you want to develop on a small lot with no exemption, there's no Z-pin. You can go develop. If you want the exemption, there's a Z-pin that gets you down to a very low percentage of parking. If you're on a bigger lot and you want to develop without going below 50%, there's no Z-pin. If you want less than 50%, there's a Z-pin. It sounds to me like a very similar process. I am eager, and I wish that I hope that we can move forward, and if there are ways for us to define it more down the line that makes it easier for staff, I would be happy to take that on too. I wish that somebody from the zoning administrator's office might have reached out and said, what would that have looked like, rather than just you're not doing it and so it's hard. So for me, Z-pin is so important to this, and to me it doesn't seem that out of line with what we already do. It's new and different territory here, but that doesn't mean that it's a bad thing. I also, again, want to point out what I've pointed out a lot of times, that my bill isn't the only bill that adds parking. The bill that was put on the table added parking, and I do think that tipping point is tough. And so I guess I'm not saying that I think CPD necessarily should have supported the bill as amended, but I'm just not also sure that you should have supported Brooks' bill based on some of the same criteria that you looked at on mine. What's really important to me at the end of the day is that, support or not support, we've had a really robust conversation and we move something forward that can be good for our communities. I also, understand that this bill as amended does make CPD and Public Works and everybody a little bit nervous. And honestly, I think that's a really good thing right now, because since we doubled down with our second vote on these amendments a couple weeks ago, I have had more awesome conversations with staff about how we are going to move very quickly on TDM and all the things at the very beginning that were said about parking management and TDM and all these great things. And so I think that this puts us in a place where it's not perfect, but it does put us heading in the right direction. I wish that tonight we were talking about a bill that was all about TDM and multimodal improvements and parking management. I wish we would have been talking about that since the beginning of this process, not getting really excited about it at the end when we're getting nervous about what's going to happen. I wish that we were talking about incentivizing mixed use as part of this. I wish that we were talking about context sensitivity and what works in downtown might not work in the highest point in Denver in District 2. And to be very clear, I don't love this bill. This bill is not my baby that I am so excited about. I think we have a lot of work to do. I don't think this is a perfect solution, but I do think it's a good start. And I think it's a good start that brings the neighborhoods, the ones who are experiencing this firsthand, not theoretically and not from a book, but in real time, in real life, in the world that we live in today, not the future condition. It brings them to the table to say, this isn't perfect, this isn't what we wanted, but it's a compromise we're willing to start with. And I think I can't remember who said it, or I'd give you total credit, but somebody said, well, if everybody in the room, there's nobody in the room who is really like, yeah, this bill, right? That means we've probably landed at a pretty good place for compromise. I feel like this is a good start. It's a good compromise. It's much better than a full exemption, which is where we are going tonight with the no vote. No vote takes us back to full exemption. And so I sincerely hope that this is the start of the conversation, not the end of it. And I would ask my colleagues to please vote yes on this good compromise so that we can start the process of moving forward. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, President Pro Tem Clark. And I'm just going to go down the line because we got them lining up, you all, and I don't know how you came in. So, Councilman Espinoza.
Thank you, Mr. President. I second Councilman Clark's comments for working with this body and allowing us the space to voice and address the concerns of our constituency, especially those impacted as yours, mine, and Councilman Clark's. It speaks well of your leadership, and thank you, wherever you are. Not listening. So I can tell you all that I don't have consensus support of even this amended version for my R&Os. It still doesn't get there, as many of your comments mentioned. No consideration for true mixed-use development, transit alternatives, or affordability. But it's a good compromise and a hammered-out amendment. And so with that, I'll be supporting it. But I wanted to speak to a few things here. A speaker mentioned how their already built existing unit went from $1,300 a month to $1,700 a month after she moved out in one day. It was re-rented. The cost of that building did not go up because of the parking requirement on that project. It was an existing building. The rental market isn't being driven by parking. Ironically, the new zoning code has always had parking reductions for projects with affordable units. Given the express difficulty demonstrated by staff to capture some of the required parking, maybe, just maybe, savvy developers seeking square footage for development would look to those affordability reductions or reductions for alternative transit to resolve design challenges that they meet on these small lots. To Councilman Clark's observations in the Q&A, staff claimed that the amendment is inconsistent with Blueprint Denver requirements related to parking. Mind you, at the time that was adopted 15 years ago, all areas were subject to Chapter 59 zoning regulations. At the time of Blueprint Denver, Tennyson Street was zoned B4. That zoning would require multifamily development to provide one space per dwelling unit. That impact is easy enough to figure out. However, if one wanted to build a structure for a brew pub, an eating place, or retail, the parking requirement would be required at a rate of 1 per 200 gross square feet. That is it's the fourth category. Sorry. If anyone's interested in Chapter 59. The entire first floor in our current amendment, the entire first floor is exempt of a 6250 lot, which remains exempt with this amendment. And we're one of those commercial uses in that old Chapter 59 zoning code. That's 31 required spaces. That's now exempt. Had we mapped to MS or MX zoning without small lot exemption, we would have been consistent with Blueprint Denver then. That is a massive reduction, and we are now, period. If the recommendation of President Brooks's task force were the language we have today, the criteria of the planning board would in fact be met and would be recommended for approval. There is nothing in this amendment that doesn't meet that criteria, despite what is being said. On the city staff, so I'm disappointed that the director of CPD has wasted so many precious staff resources defending the president's text amendment on a fraction of 1% of the developable land in this city. Those are resources that could have been working on helping fund transit through development of transit demand management policies or land value capture. We could and should be 60 days into that future. Mind you, I now know that we are in fact working on that. Thank God. But I've been talking about that specifically to the director of CPD almost since the day I got here. So I wish we were voting today on TDM and land value capture because those are the tools. We were presented long ago. The case was made that when we rezoned in 2010, we did not have restrictive enough base zoning. So some of these asks that we're trying to make are going to be harder and heavier lifting because we have already massively reduced the parking requirements in this city. That is the model that other communities are looking at, our base zoning without exemptions. In fact, to the point about cities not making increasing parking requirements, Boston, South Boston, just 3 months ago, increased their parking requirements from 0.9 spaces per unit to 1.5. Why? Neighborhood preservation. So there is a give and take here. I am totally on board with getting 100% parking exemption, but we need to have the tools and skills adopted by this city and put in place so that we can get there in a more managed, thoughtful way. And so with that, I will be supporting this amendment because I think it's as good as we can do right now. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Councilman Espinoza. Councilman Lopez.
Thank you, Mr. President. First of all, let me thank you for all of your work, Councilman. You are very passionate. You stayed on top of this. You convened a lot of people. And in the last vote that we had on this bill, I saw the disappointment that you had. I don't want you to think for 1 second that this is a critique of your work or your work ethic or your leadership. I think, I say this, and I know my colleagues and just folks around us know how hard you work. And I wanted to commend you for that on the floor. This is a tricky issue, and why I kind of felt conflicted going back and forth. And what it did is, for me, is it allowed me to take a look at how this would apply to my area a little bit more. And I cannot, so I did. I was able to engage with more of my constituents, with folks across the city, and kind of compare the two. And I know this song, man, I feel like the Rolling Stones. I need to sing the same song with the same kind of excitement as I did the first time, right? So it's a little tricky, but it comes across, it actually is pretty good. I'm looking at Paul Cashman, and I know he's looking at me real skeptical, thinking I'm going to poke fun at the Stones. I'm not. So that's how it comes across. I'm glad you're laughing, sir. Someone's laughing at my joke. So I say this because the woman that got up, I don't know if she's still here, but she got up and said that, you know, their family grew, they had a child, and they're looking for a place that was like $1,700 a month. I can't help but think, come west. There are some places in Barnum and Villa Park, in our neck of the woods on the west side that are about that budget, and you're going to get a good unit. I mean, you'll get 3 bedrooms with your own driveway and your own yard for about that much. It's still expensive, still absolutely expensive to live in Denver, no matter where it is. Everybody's getting squeezed out. I paid a lot of attention to her because I'm wondering why she hasn't come west. And when I ask people, well, why out here? Well, it's not as connected. And it's the same answer I've gotten. It's not as connected. And then I go back into my neighborhoods, and I don't need to go back. I mean, I'm from the neighborhood. I eat, sleep, and I mean, JJ is I was a pitcher. He was a third baseman. We were on the same team, literally, in Little League. Not much has changed on our side of the river. And even with plans, and I wanted to make sure that Cindy didn't feel attacked when I said this. I just was honestly looking for an update. Cindy's an amazing visionary over at Public Works. You are. But it goes back to my argument. If we were, so there's 2 ways this is framed. One is affordability, the other is mass transit. This whole argument for and against. And this is why I'm going to tell you why I'm supporting this, but also I supported this amendment because if we were so ingrained in wanting to make this happen, multimodal city happen, the BRT would be without question on the west side. It's not even funded going past Federal Boulevard. We had to fight for it just to come across the river. I was told a million times that you couldn't put it on Colfax. Well, the hill, it's heavy and all that stuff. Well, they usually, there's trains in San Francisco, so if a train can exist in San Francisco over on a steep grade, it can in Denver. And then just the planning, when we are looking at the west side, kind of the neighborhood plans and bringing them up to speed, and these are plans that were done, that were created all about the car, and it was all about just driving everywhere. These are plans from the 80s, 90s. They're not going to get touched until 2019, according to the phasing that they're working on in CPD. I won't even be a councilman, and we're all about it. We want to start now, but we just don't have the capacity to do it. We don't have the staff to actually get it done. So that, and then, you know, I came to this council a year ago with a simple amendment to the budget to ask for a block of sidewalk on South Florida on the west side, Southwest Denver, $170,000. I mean, it's not cheap, but it's also not going to break us. That request was denied. I couldn't get more than 4 votes for that. So where is this multimodal city I've been hearing about? Not in the west side. Now, we've been pushing. Give some folks some credit. We've been pushing. But the bike boulevard that we needed implemented, they said we were going to implement Denver's first bike boulevard 4 years ago. We still don't have it. I'm seeing it all built out and striped all over this place down here. We're not getting it over there. So I don't buy this thing about, well, we want to make it so that you can get anywhere. Well, apparently not in the west side. That's what we're fighting for. And look, it's not a critique on our staff. It's not a critique on the people that make it work. It's the critique on our priorities as a city and our budget, what we're not willing to fund. The other thing is affordability. I don't think this isn't an issue about affordability, folks. Seattle, Portland, people that are kind of getting, they're with it, they still have an affordable housing crisis. You look at other cities with equivalent or higher parking requirements that are more affordable: Denver, Phoenix, Albuquerque, Salt Lake City, Dallas, Columbus, Ohio. This exemption has been around for 6.5 years. You think that's made a dent in our affordable housing crisis? It hasn't. And also, go take a look at some of these micro units. Call them. Pretend you're I'm trying to be cool, like, get in there and be like, hey, I want a unit, and I don't want to share anything. I'm a millennial, whatever, right? Well, I want to share everything. I'm a millennial. I want a small unit, IKEA couch, whatever. You call them, ask what the month rent is. It's $1,300 for 400 square feet. Are these really affordable? Are these families? And if that's what we're incentivizing in these locations, then how is this going to increase affordable housing? And you know, one of our just to bring something out, and I don't want to belabor, and I'm sorry, but I really need to make this point because last time I was conflicted. Somebody on our council said, "Well, why don't we all walk or bike or transit for a whole week to work?" For Joel, that was you that said that. Well, Jolin's the guy that's taking all the heat, saying they call him the parking councilman. He's the only one biking down here, right? I'll tell you what, I would, but I have a daughter to pick up after school and take to her after school program. I have a mother to go leave dinner for who lives outside of Denver. I got to do that every single day. I can't do it on a bicycle. I can't do it on the 16. And let's try, this is fine and dandy when it's warm outside, but what happens in the winter? So this is why I supported the amendment, and this is why I support this moving forward, is until we're there, I'm not there. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Councilman Lopez. Councilman Cashman.
Thank you, Mr. President. What a joy this meeting is. Any of you want to get up and stretch or drink some poison, whatever it'd take to make you feel better, please feel free. So, when I've said this before, so excuse me if you've heard this before, but when people ask me what is my biggest surprise since taking this job, I always tell them two things. I tell them that my biggest surprise is how competent city staff is, by and large. I mean, when I was just another citizen out there at home, I'm reading the paper and watching TV and thinking, these people are idiots. They don't know what they're doing. They don't care. And you see that once every how many years expose because some poor parks worker was overtired and took a nap in his truck, and so everyone thinks everyone's sleeping through the day. And you get inside the process a little bit, and you realize how competent and how hardworking these people are. And people ask me about my council colleagues, and I tell them, we're obviously 13 different people, and it ranges from fairly conservative to fairly liberal, but we're a very collegial group. I mean, we work together well. I think Councilman Brooks does a wonderful job as a whole, as our leader this year in facilitating that collegial atmosphere. And the reason I bring this up is I don't think any of us have done our best work on this process. I think as we've gotten into it, the topic has revealed itself to be more complicated, and I think it deserved more time and more time in the weeds to, I don't know, I believe that staff is having fits over the idea of Z-Pin. I believe they're seeing some real problems with it, and I think with more time, maybe it would be a different kind of pin, and it would have different types of processes, but I believe we can make it work, and I think you know, we're looking at these maps with quarter-mile, half-mile areas around transit zones. I'm thinking, why are we getting off the transit corridor? Maybe we stay on the transit corridor. I'm concerned about Councilwoman Sussman and her concerns about Colfax. There are areas that I think we really need to pay attention to. But for me, I'm just very clear what my constituents want out of this process. You know, I think we've made some fairly mediocre sausage. You know, if I were ordering breakfast at Sam's 3 and this was the sausage, I'd probably either ask for bacon or some cottage cheese on the side. We need to continue working on this. And also, I mean, I need to just reiterate, I mean, where people are sitting here with, oh my God, you're changing the world as we see it. It's 1% of the lots in the city, okay? 1% of the lots in the city. That's not saying I'm satisfied with this. I think I've been clear. We need to keep working on this. No one's happy with this. This is not doing what anyone wants. And, you know, affordable housing, please, please, please. You know, I can get an affordable meal at the Brown Palace, at Ruth's Chris, at the fanciest restaurants in the city if I want to go eat a potato and go home and call that a meal. That's not, to me, a meal, and $1,000, $1,200, $1,300, $1,400 for 400 square feet is not affordable housing, you know? I mean, it's just not my definition of affordable housing. So I will, I'll be supporting this sausage. You know, and Councilman Clark and I sat down with the director of CPD just because we wanted to exchange ideas and look for ways that we can figure out these remaining gaps. How do we get development on Colfax and protect the neighborhoods that I believe deserve being protected? My friend Espinosa, Councilman Espinosa, said a few meetings ago that, and I definitely empathize with this, there are people in these neighborhoods who have been building these great neighborhoods for decades. So let's give them a wee bit of slack because they don't want 104 units dumped on their block with no parking. I get the argument against. I'm concerned about the argument against. I always keep in mind when I'm assessing these issues and I get to the point where I believe what I believe, I always keep in mind I might be wrong. You know, I might be wrong. My vote might be the wrong vote. But this is the way I'm seeing it today. Thank you, staff, very much. I think you're all incredibly talented people. So we're at odds on this one. So be it. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Councilman Cashman. Councilman New?
Thank you, Mr. President. I just echo the thanks to Councilman Clark and Councilman Brooks, and also to Councilman Cashman. He filled in while Councilman Brooks was out and carried the ball initially, and was part of all the discussion with the group. And so, thank you for all your leadership on that. I also want to thank all the residents. You know, Bob and David especially, and Margie. I mean, the analysis y'all did were just unbelievable. Every time you come in my office, you bring out some new analytical report and data that you accumulated, and it was so thorough and professional. I just really appreciate you helping us with understand all the issues that were on your mind and what was important to you and your neighborhood. So I really appreciate that. I got really excited when Cindy Patton came up because I thought Cindy was going to lay out a transportation plan for us, but I knew she was going to do her best to answer Paul's questions, but we still don't have that plan, and hopefully we'll have it soon and look forward to it. I was glad when Councilwoman Sussman called up Joel. Joel's such a smart guy, on the planning board, and his comments about character are right on target with Colfax. We've been talking about that quite a bit for the last year or so, but I think it's going to come down to a discussion about character and density when we get to Colfax. It's all going to be about affordable housing and density and what's going to happen to Colfax and transit going down the heart of Colfax. So it's going to be a very interesting discussion. I really wish that we had that transportation plan, and I really wish we had Councilman Sussman's transit agency that she's been talking about so fervently. So she's right on target that the city's got to have a transit agency to help implement that plan and take control of our transportation system. So, and if we had that plan and that agency, I think tonight would be a totally different discussion. We wouldn't be talking so much about parking. I think we'd be talking about developing and moving people around and possibly even getting people out of the cars. So maybe that'll happen one of these days. But I think what the the amended approach is a balanced approach, and so I can't imagine us going back to the old ordinance and being totally exempt. So I think in my constituents believe that too. You know, I do surveys on all the major issues with all my constituents, and I get about 800 to 1,000 residents giving me feedback, and this was the highest I've ever had on a survey so far in my 2 years. And 85% of my residents said no to the exemptions. But if they had a choice between three, and you know, Councilman Clark and Councilman Brooks, and it was Councilman Clark was the amendment that they preferred. So I'll vote yes tonight, and I'll encourage my colleagues to do so. And like everyone said, you know, we got to keep working on this. This is just the start of this whole thing. We've got to get transit and transportation solved and implemented in our city to become a great city. So thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Councilman New. Councilwoman Ortega.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also want to thank not only my colleagues, Councilman Brooks and Councilman Clark, for their work on this. I want to thank city staff and folks from the neighborhoods on both sides that were passionate in bringing forth various points of views that helped us get to something that I think is an even better compromise. You know, over the years, as I have been involved in the land use process, City Council clearly is responsible for this, and it is not unusual to have a recommendation come out of the planning board that is not supported by City Council. So, you know, and again, this is part of the deliberative process that we go through in listening to community and making sure that we're trying to find that you know, important balance between the various points of view. You know, I can remember back when the Chamber took a large group of people to Vancouver, and everybody came back excited about wanting to see more density in the city of Denver. This was before 2003 when we had, you know, 10 members of City Council leave. That's when we started talking about density, and everybody kept saying, where we see density, we're going to see affordability. Well, in our large developments, that hasn't translated to affordability. So where you would think in large-scale developments, where we're you know, seeing massive units being developed, we should see affordability, but that hasn't been the case. So to expect that in small unit developments, you know, doesn't mean that's going to translate either. The other thing I think is important as we talk about the need for transit management, a TDM for the core of the city. You know, we've got a great one out at Stapleton that's doing great work. They've got businesses providing discounted passes for their workers. But guess what? RTD just did away with that discounted bus pass. So how do we make sure that there's equity in the kind of work that we're talking about so that people who are the poorest among us could afford to ride public transit? They're the people who need it the most, and by and large end up paying more, because when you look at, you know, the fact that, you know, government employees, the city discounts that pass for city employees. You know, there are other programs, but when it comes to folks who are at the bottom of the pay scale, they're the ones that get hit the hardest with the affordable housing, the highest transportation costs. So we got to find something that works for everybody and doesn't create this push-out effect that says, you know, geez, you're a city that we just can't accommodate you, so you got to go somewhere else that you can afford. And that's the wrong message I think we as a city should be working to address. So I'm going to be supporting this amendment tonight. Again, I think the deliberations that have taken place have been an important part of the process, and I appreciate the work that everybody has done on all sides of this issue. Thank you, Mr. President.
And thank you, Councilwoman Ortega. Councilwoman Sussman.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm afraid I'm not part of this kumbaya group. I'm going to probably be the first one to speak against support of this bill. It's, I feel like Councilman Cashman does, that we are a very collegial group, and we do work well together. But we've had the leader of this bill say it's not a good bill, but I'm going to back it anyway. We had Mr. Cashman say, it's mediocre sausage, but I'm going to vote for it anyway. I just don't know if that's a sustainable way in which to vote. Let's make bills that we don't like, but let's vote for them anyway. I think that, well, first of all, we're putting a lot into 6,250 square feet. And it seems, it's a small thing. But we have to maintain our principles and our vision and our ways for transforming our city. I think making decisions like this puts us on the wrong side of history. This bill moves us a little step backward. We've had taken great strides, a couple of steps forward. But we have to keep pure to our ideas of what it's going to take to really turn around this city and reduce the amount of single occupancy vehicles. And there's lots of research out there about how to do that. We want a walkable, bikeable, transit-rich city. Neighbors are concerned about congestion. The top three issues in my district are traffic, traffic, and traffic. The only way you can move forward on something like this is to make really hard decisions that are unpopular with some and popular with others. But we have to stop subsidizing car use with low gas prices, low gas tax, roads that are built primarily for cars that have for generations had the right of way before all people, these 3,000-pound things. And the other thing is parking requirements. It's a huge subsidy for car users, huge. We all feel like we deserve a free parking space. Our cars deserve a free parking space. Where did that come from? There is so much research out there how minimum parking requirements and the other subsidies are a major part of our problem with congestion. And to say it isn't so, I'm going to just be kind of harsh here, sounds like science deniers. You can say, okay, this is what they're saying in the science, but I really don't want to do that. There's just no evidence otherwise than that we have to reduce our subsidy for cars and the way in which our country is. And I'm making all these, grandiose statements on a little thing, whether 3 stories get exemptions or 2 stories get exemptions. It's a really small thing. But when you've got a plan and you have a transformative vision and you have a goal, you can't let the little things slip by you. You can't do that. You're compromising your principles. The other principle that I believe in too is community input. Councilman Brooks ran a very comprehensive community process at looking all the issues related to this, and they made a plan. I'm not sure I wouldn't have supported the original parking exemption for small lots for all of the reasons that CPD did and the planning board did. But at least we had a community process. And I know those people who were on that project are feeling like they were unheard. Where did their recommendations go? Why were they unheeded? Why? And then I've even heard one say, why participate if you're not heeded? I just wish that, and I wanted to say, our CPD leader took the time, and our CPD people took the time to look at this because we asked them to. We put a moratorium on this, and so they had to spend their time and resources on this because the council asked them to. And TDM is an important issue. I'm glad we're talking about it, but it's not just CPD, it's public works, it's housing, it's all of the agencies in our city. This particular 6,200 feet, 6,250 feet, has a lot to do with my Colfax issues and federal. It has a lot to do with affordable housing. It has a lot to do with the way we want our city to look. And it has a lot to do with equity in the ways we move around, that pedestrians, bicycles, and cars should have equal access to our right-of-way. They should have equal access. And that's an important value. It's probably not as popular, but it is the science. And I won't be voting for this change. Thanks.
Thank you, Councilwoman Sussman. Councilwoman Black.
Thank you. I hate it that I'm next because I am so wavering. This has been the best public comment. Everyone here has had a very persuasive argument, and I really appreciate you all being here and being here so late. I'm very tired, and I'm sure you are too, because I have a much more comfortable seat. And thank you, CPD. I'm very dismayed because I feel like there's a lot of misunderstanding about the original parking exemption, which actually was about neighborhood preservation, and it was about small scale and historic buildings. And it dismays me that now it's if you support the exemption that you're against neighborhoods, because that's not what it is, just as Councilwoman Sussman just said. I feel like it's turned into now a fight over who owns the street parking, and that's not what it was ever intended to be. And I also think it's not right that it's somehow a developer against neighborhood, because that's not what it is either. It was intended to preserve small scale buildings and not tear them all down and build a giant monstrosity like we have on South University in his district. Anyway, that said, both the exemption and both of the compromises, the Brooks Compromise and the Clark Compromise, were well-intended, incredibly imperfect, have unintended consequences, and they don't necessarily solve the problems that they intended to solve. We need a much more pointed and neighborhood-specific solution, as John Hayden, I think he already left, and others suggested. Every part of our city is unique. There's only one part of my district that has small lots. The rest of my district has more parking than we could ever fill. In fact, if you want to park in my district and take the light rail into town, you should do it. The one neighborhood that is impacted, however, is undergoing incredible change and densification right now, and they support Jolin's bill and have asked me to support it. Councilman Sussman is right. Nobody is excited about it. Sue Glassmacher said it's mediocre at best. Keith Pryor said this particular bill is not addressing the issue. We need to look at better ways to preserve small lots and encourage affordable housing and mixed use. I've wavered if I'm going to support it or I'm not going to support it. I think it's going to pass. I told you my RNO has asked me to support it. I don't think the exemption has been successful. It hasn't, I don't think it's resulted in affordable housing. I think there's been unintended consequences. Sharon Nunnally said we can still work on it, and that's the spirit I like the best, is that whatever we had wasn't what we needed, but we need to all get together and find a better solution. So I'm still pondering this, but thank you.
How could you be pondering after all this time? Okay.
Everyone's so persuasive.
Councilwoman Black, thank you for your great comments. Councilman Flynn.
Thank you.
Sorry, sir.
Thank you, Mr. President. I think I'm most distressed to hear that Councilwoman Sussman is going to destroy the Flynn corollary that I developed back in the 80s and 90s over at the press table, that the longer we debated and talked and commented, it seemed the more unanimous the vote would turn out to be. So another one bites the dust. All 13 of us up here, those who are present and the 3 who are absent tonight, have free, reserved, private parking in the most transit-rich node in all of Colorado. And to my knowledge, only Councilman Clark and I frequently use alternative modes. Councilman bicycles, although he has that power assist battery that's really kind of cool.
Yeah, it's cheating.
It's a cheat. It's a cheat.
Cheating.
And he's a young guy. He's a young guy, despite looking as old as he does. But, and I take light rail, but I have to drive to Englewood because there's no reliable transit for me to get to Englewood Station to come in. And as Councilman Lopez mentioned, last week I did email all of us and said, why don't we try to use alternative mode to come here last week to see, to get some appreciation for it. No one took me up on the offer. And I regret to say that I couldn't do it any day either because of the demands of my schedule to be here and there at certain times. I wish that we could be nuanced enough and nimble enough so that we could address the very legitimate concerns that I share with Councilwoman Sussman and along Federal Boulevard to try to maintain the character in the small parcels. I wish that we were nimble enough to be able to address those without also suffocating the bungalows of Platt Park and West Wash Park by straitjacketing them with the exact same one-size-fits-all jacket. It seems to me that sometimes we argue for strict uniformity of regulation because we like predictability and certainty when it suits our ultimate philosophical purpose, but then when it doesn't, we like to be context sensitive. I wish we had a context sensitive solution to this. I'm going to obviously vote yes for this, but I will work with every other member and with CPD to try to find a more flexible and nimble solution so that what works on Colfax but doesn't work in Platt Park can still go ahead. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Councilman Flynn. All right. Councilman Cashman and Lopez, I'm going to go to Councilwoman Gilmore just to give, since you guys already went. Is that
I
okay?
already leaned forward. Do I have to lean back?
You got to lean back in that comfy chair there. Okay, Councilwoman Gilmore.
Thank you, President Brooks. Listening very thoughtfully to all of the public comment and all of the great conversation by my colleagues, the one thing that either bill really highlights is our enormous gaps in transit in the city. And it's unfortunate and unequitable, I think, to pit affordable housing against a failing transit system when we're also trying to maintain the character of our neighborhoods. Because I think there's a much broader and bigger conversation that we need to be having. And as it's been said time and time again, it's not a perfect solution, but Councilman Clark's amended bill is a compromise, and what I hope is an interim solution to this issue, but that we're going to have to come back and address it again and again and again. The one thing that we haven't necessarily talked about in an intentional way is the equity question that this brings up, especially for my family who resides in the Montbello community. And I would love to take Councilman Flynn up on his, challenge to take transit to come to the city and county building. That's not a reality for me. I have children who are in school who need to be there at a certain time. They need to be picked up midday. And so I just hope through all of the conversation that we've had here tonight that we can elevate the conversation to one that looks at transit and affordable housing and a TDM plan from an equity lens, so that we're making sure that we're not only addressing certain parts of the city, but that we are truly being inclusive and including Councilman Lopez's district and my district and all the people in Denver, and that to have the privilege to utilize transit, you live in certain areas of the city. And unfortunately, that doesn't always cover all the communities of color in the city. And so I hope that we can work more to broaden the conversation where it needs to go, so that my 3 kids can choose if they want to own a car or not, that it's not a necessity for them to own a car. And so that being said, I'm going to go ahead and support Council Bill 161. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Councilwoman. All right, Councilman Cashman and Councilman
Thank
Lopez.
you, sir. I will keep this brief, but I had to answer a couple of things. Look, I take this job very seriously. I don't set out in the morning to make legislation that I'm not proud of. If it wasn't clear enough, I support what I consider a mediocre bill because I consider the alternative poisonous. To go back to a place with no parking restrictions, I think makes no sense at all. So that the inference that somehow people are satisfied with mediocre legislation, I couldn't let sit. And to infer that we're somehow science deniers when this entire council placed as its #1 budget priority increased mobility and transportation. And then on this one issue that affects 1% of the lots in the city, we disagree, makes no sense to me. I mean, Brother Murray has already tweeted out my sausage comment. You know, it makes an easy headline. I'd have done the same thing when I was writing, so no offense taken, John. But yeah, I mean, what I said before about the fact I don't think we worked well together. You know, you have the legislative and the executive branches, and there's separation of powers, but we need to partner better sometimes. And I'm seeing another situation evolve that I'm interested in, where I'm seeing silos when they sometimes don't serve us real well, so we need to work better at that. You know, I sat with Councilwoman Sussman, with the mayor, urging him to form that Department of Mobility or Transportation or Transit, whatever you want to talk about. So I think we have 13 people up here who are very clear on the need to improve transit, to improve mobility options, to provide affordable housing, and we're just differing on this one tiny part of that discussion. So thank you and good night.
Thank you, Councilman Cashman. Councilman Lopez.
You know, I realized I forgot to, a couple of things, and I'll be quick. I forgot to thank Joel as well, too. Councilman Clark and Councilman Brooks, you know, for both of your work and your advocacy on that. And just on that tip, Councilman Cashman, look, the one thing I did not say, I mean, we complain about the sausage, but we don't talk about how to make it better sometimes. So here are, if you really want to go after affordable housing, give somebody a living wage so rent doesn't become an issue, for crying out loud. Let's pay somebody a fair wage so that, you know, 1 month to the other, they don't get kicked out because they can't make rent. Wages is still low, and we have an opportunity to make that happen. And we really have to put a dent in affordable housing that way. And just think beyond micro units. There are families. I want families to get on transit routes. I want families to bike together. None of us up here believe in a 1980s Denver where, you know, we're pumping crude and filling up at the tank and at the gas station and just driving around just for the sake of it. Right? We want to see this multimodal Denver, but we want to see it equitably. Fully fund the BRT on Colfax. Playboy calls it the longest, wickedest street in America. That alone would be an awesome ride. Fund it, right? Fund these sidewalks, and not just with bond money, but it's upon us. It's us as council to say this is the money that we want to put towards our priorities. We can't just make it a priority and a plan and have our awesome staff work on it, our awesome city employees work on it, and not fund it. We have to fund it, right? That's where. Let's put our money where our mouth is. The second thing, and Councilman Brooks, you're gonna probably censure me after this.
I was going to do that prior, but...
Denver's Brooklyn Bridge, that Colfax Viaduct, and you cannot bike across it well, you cannot walk across it well. Let's transform it. It's the one thing that has kept the west side and the east side from not being one city. That's the biggest problem. Let's fix the Colfax Viaduct. You can bike, walk, and drive, and maybe even take the train across it. Too bad Colfax being the longest street in America, the only way you can do it is driving. Let's fix that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman Lopez. I think it's the first time Playboy's ever been quoted in a council meeting. All right.
Yeah, read the articles.
Councilman Espinoza.
Hopefully you won't take off this time when I praise you. You'll have to rewind the tape. But that's all I'm going to do right now. It doesn't necessarily need to be said, but this is, Councilman or President Brooks, you heard your constituents express this concern. You took action. You led this moratorium process. You led that discussion. So this is your bill. I mean, you may not agree with the text amendments, but these words are your words, and you put this out, and that's directly in response to what you heard. And so it needs to be noted that this is not, that is you doing your job representing your constituents, and us doing our job representing our constituents, trying to put this forward. So whether it feels like it or not, I see this as the Brooks Clark bill. Because you got us here to a point where we're talking about things and moving forward on that TDM discussion and all these things, because we recognize that we don't have the tools that we actually need to make Denver the sort of pedestrian, bike, transit city that we know it needs to be. And so I just want to say that, thank you for listening to those concerns, because it would have been possible to not. And the fact that we're here today, I just, again, want to thank you. So thanks.
Thank you, Councilman Espinoza. All right, we got some others up. Councilman Flynn and then Ortega.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just a brief note, because no meeting would be complete without some pointless historical trivia from me. But just to follow up on Councilman Lopez, the Colfax Viaduct originally was built with the Larimer Viaduct and opened in 1916, was built for Denver Tramway at a total cost of $715,000. Thank you. Built for transit, not for automobiles.
Okay, thank you, Councilman Flynn, for that
How
important
much concrete?
history. Councilwoman Ortega.
I'll be really brief. And this is probably for a different conversation, but can we talk quality design? I think we should be ensuring that we have units that are going to last for generations into the future, and not units that are going to be, falling apart that need to be replaced in, 5-10 years from now. So different conversation for a different time, but it's a missing part of the overall big picture conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, and a plug for Councilman Espinoza's urban design deal happening on Wednesday. If you're not available to attend, send somebody who can. It's a pretty interesting conversation at 12 o'clock in the committee. Okay, I'm going to speak. I'm going to be the last one to speak. Is one of the privileges that you get as president, and this is a bill that I've been a part of. Councilman Clark, thank you so much for working hard. It's as you can tell, we're friends. Frenemies? No, just joking. We're friends. And it's so great to have very different perspectives on this small piece of legislation. Folk, come together and figure out a way forward. So I really appreciate you on that. Staff, thank you so much. I know you've been through a lot, and you've been great, and you've provided some incredible information. And Ryan, Winterberg, wherever you are in Portland, appreciate you. To the committee that serves, some of you guys are here. Some of you left this conversation a long time ago when you started getting emails from people because people can be a little harsh and not realize the time that you put in. And so I just want to thank you all for walking through that process. Councilwoman Jeannie Robb, who originally took this up in 2011, thank you. And then to all the people who are still here at 9:15 when you can be doing a million other things. You are here because you love this city. Thank you. You went through security. Some of you paid for parking. And you're sitting in hard seats, and we really appreciate you. And we always respect the right for you to petition your government. It makes us better, so thank you. George Mail, I want to respond to you. We are not having a conversation really with developers. And I want to respond to a lot of emails that I've received that this is mostly developers and neighbors. I can count the number of developers who have been a part of the conversations in the last 9 months. And it's really neighbors and neighbors. Neighbors that have a certain opinion around transportation mobility, neighbors that feel like we're not getting there yet on transportation mobility. So this is actually a very tough, complex issue because you can't just make it black and white and make a quick decision. So I just wanted to say that. Councilwoman Ortega, she drove home my point, and I appreciate you bringing in the urban design. I think that, and I counted, that's the 11th topical issue that have been thrown onto this very little bitty deal called 6250 lots. It's less than 1%, just so you know, not more, not one, less than 1% of our overall makeup of 151 square miles. And I get it. There are a lot of issues in our city, but I believe we try to solve way too many things. And it got very confusing. We have parking issues in our city. We have urban design issues in our city. We have affordable housing issues in our city. That won't be solved with 6250 square lot exemption. It won't. But you've helped us to say we need to have outlets on urban design. We need to have outlets on affordable housing. We need to do this. We need to do that. We need to do TDM. You've helped us. But this isn't going to solve it. So the last piece of this, well, not really the last piece, but I do have to point out something real quick because we had the affordable housing and folks got poo-pooed and, you know, this is not affordable housing. Yes, it is, you know, all this conversation. According to HUD, income limits for 80% AMI units, do you know what the price point is? Anybody want to know? $1,176. Most of these micro units are actually identified as 80% AMI. So I'm not trying to drive home anyone's point. I think it's important to know that standard, that if you're at an 80% AMI, the max rent that you can charge in the city is $1,176. Okay, so the city of Denver, we pride ourselves, all of us, to putting forward, you know, progressive legislation and leading the nation in certain issues. We definitely do that socially. We rarely do that from a transportation mobility perspective. I think we're starting to, which is really exciting. Unfortunately, both groups in the social justice part and even in the transportation mobility justice and injustice, they don't talk, they don't connect, and this is very apparent during this conversation. I feel like we as a city can be doing much more progressive things around our transportation mobility issues. And it's one of the things that has really come clear to me in having this conversation and pushed me in some areas that I must be much more progressive in the way that I think around this. But I'll be making my decision tonight on two things. Fear-based over data-driven analysis. I want to know what is the 6250 development that has been built in this city that is causing anxiety. We don't have one. Now, there are some suppositions that could happen when one comes, and we're thinking about, well, this will happen, but we really don't have a development before us that we can study and analyze and say, okay, because of this, we know that, and now let's make a decision. My bill didn't do that. Councilman Clark's bill didn't do that. And I can't support that. I think we need to go back to the drawing board. I love where Councilman Clark is going in the TDM, but over the conversations that I've had from both sides of my neighbors, I do think we need to go back to the drawing board. What that would mean is today, if we voted this down, the moratorium, May 26th, the moratorium is up. And we can have a conversation about where we go from here. But I'm just saying, I'm not going to put my name on this because I just can't. There's too many questions. There's too many unanswered questions around it. And with that, Madam Secretary, roll call.
Clark.
Aye.
Espinosa.
Aye.
Flynn.
Aye.
Gilmore.
Aye.
Cashman.
Aye.
Lopez.
Aye.
New.
Aye.
Ortega.
Aye.
Sussman.
No.
Black.
Aye.
Mr. President.
No. Please close the voting and announce the results.
Sorry, I'm just making sure. Black didn't vote. Brooks? It's in the system.
There we go.
Oh, my screen's off.
Is it working?
Hers
No.
isn't. She was a aye.
Aye,
9-2.
okay.
There it is.
Yes.
Okay.
9-2, that's correct.
Yeah,
9-2.
9 ayes, 2 nays. Council Bill 161 has passed as amended. Seeing no other business before this body, we stand adjourned. Thank you, everybody.